I showed up at my daughter's house on Christmas Eve, hoping to sit with family. Instead, I heard her introduce me to the guests, that old man. Yeah, that's my dad. They set me on a folding chair by the kitchen door, like I didn't belong. My chest burned, remembering all the years I worked 2 jobs just to raise her after her mama passed. It felt like my very name, my worth, had been stripped away in front of strangers. But what they didn't know was that I carried an envelope in my coat pocket, one my late wife left behind, with her last words and her final wishes. When Santa stepped in that night, he brought more than gifts. He carried the truth that would turn this whole house upside down. Stay with me to see how my Christmas Eve humiliation became the night my dignity was restored. And tell me, what city are you watching from? The cold night air clung to my coat as I climbed the short steps to my daughter's front porch in Charlotte. Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, I wasn't looking forward to walking into a home filled with family laughter, being 75, widowed, and often alone. I told myself this evening would be different, that maybe tonight Darlie would see me not as a burden, but as her father. The door opened before I could knock. A half-hearted greeting slipped from her lips. "Dad, you're here. Come in." No hug, no warmth, just a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. The smell of cinnamon and roasted ham wafted from the kitchen, but the air carried a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Guests inside were strangers to me, neighbors and friends I'd never met. Their eyes slid past as if I were invisible. Then the words landed like ice water. "That old man." "Yeah, that's my dad." Her voice carried enough for half the room to hear. A laugh followed from someone standing nearby. Though it wasn't funny, my chest tightened, and I swallowed the sting. In that moment, every sacrifice I'd made for her, the nights working double shifts, the mornings skipping meals so she'd have enough, came rushing back like ghosts. And here I stood, introduced as if I were nothing more than a nuisance. Dinner was called, and I walked toward the dining room expecting at least a small seat at the long oak table. Instead, Scott, my son-in-law, motioned toward a flimsy folding chair tucked against the kitchen doorway. "You can sit here, Orenthal. Easy access to the kitchen." His tone was polite, but the choice was clear. The main seats, the cushioned ones around the table, were filled quickly by everyone else. Lowering myself onto the chair, I felt its legs wobble. From this corner, I could hear plates clinking and laughter flowing, but I wasn't part of it. A father pushed to the margins of his own bloodline. That little chair wasn't just furniture. It was a message. Outsider. Afterthought. As conversation swirled, I stayed quiet. My mind drifted back to Christmases, when my late wife and I sat together at the head of our own table, our children's eyes shining as they tore into presents. Back then, I led the prayer. Back then, I mattered. Now, dignity was stripped by gestures so small most would miss them, yet they cut deeper than any blade. I kept my eyes on the twinkling lights of the tree in the corner. Nostalgia ached in my bones, sorrow mixing with a quiet resolve. My family once looked to me as their rock. Now they acted as though I were a relic, something to be stored away. Then, near the tree, a movement caught my eye. Darlie leaned close to Scott. Their voices dropped, but I caught fragments. "After tonight, the house will be ours." My breath stilled. Scott slipped a white envelope into her hand, quick and discreet. Music from the stereo swelled, covering the rest of their words, but suspicion clawed its way through me. The folding chair, the insult, the cold smiles, suddenly they weren't random cruelties. They were warnings, signs of something darker waiting behind the laughter and carols. I knew then that the folding chair was only the beginning of something darker. As the music played faintly, I watched Scott slip a white envelope under Darlie's hand, and my heart sank. The soft chime of Christmas carols floated through the living room. but they did little to calm the unease that had been gnawing at me since I caught sight of Scott passing that envelope to Darlie. Their voices had been hushed, their movements deliberate, as though I wasn't meant to notice. The music, cheerful and familiar, clashed against the cold edge in the room. Something about this Christmas Eve felt different, like the warmth had been drained and replaced with a rehearsed politeness. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was imagining things, but every time I glanced at my daughter, I could see the distance in her eyes, the way she barely looked in my direction. Loneliness dug in deeper, a bitter taste I couldn't wash away. This was supposed to be a night for family, for belonging. Yet somehow I felt more like a guest than a father. When the moment came for the family to gather for prayers, I instinctively rose to join them. In years past, it had always been my role to lead. I remembered kneeling at the head of the table, my hands clasped, guiding my children through words of gratitude, reminding them of what mattered. Tonight, though, as I stepped forward, Darlie's hand shot up like a stop sign. "You can sit, Dad," she said lightly, her smile thin, her tone firm. "We'll handle this." The words stung sharper than any insult. My chest tightened as I stood there, half between them and the folding chair by the kitchen. I wanted to argue, to remind her whose hands had built this family's foundation, but the lump in my throat betrayed me. Instead, I stepped back, watching as Scott took my place, his voice carrying the prayer I should have spoken. The family bowed their heads, glasses lifted for the toast, while I sat down alone. The sound of their laughter filled the air, but none of it reached me. I stared at the candlelight flickering across their faces and wondered when I had become a shadow at the edge of their celebration. After the toast, Scott called for everyone to gather near the tree for a photo. Children scampered over, their holiday outfits crisp and new, while Darlie positioned herself carefully in the middle. I started to move forward, but Scott clapped me on the shoulder with a grin that felt more like a shove. "Why don't you take the picture?" "Dad," he said, the word Dad dressed in mock respect. A ripple of laughter followed, and before I could protest, the camera was pressed into my hands. I lifted it, my fingers trembling slightly, and snapped the photo of my family smiling without me. Darlie, Scott, the children all perfectly framed, perfectly complete in a world that no longer seemed to include me. It struck harder than the folding chair had, a seat you could recover from, but a photograph. That was forever, someday. When they looked back, they'd see this night without me, as though I never existed. The flash from the camera blinded me for a moment, but what lingered wasn't light. It was the darkness of being erased. Sinking back into my chair, I let my mind drift to old albums tucked away in my home. I could still see the photos of Christmases past, where my arms encircled the children, where I sat at the center, proud and certain of my place. Now those memories clashed cruelly against the reality unfolding in front of me. When had I become disposable? The evening dragged on, laughter and chatter weaving around me like a cage. Then, just as I began to gather myself, I saw Darlie at the corner of the room, her back turned to the others. She slipped the white envelope, Scott's envelope, into a drawer, locking it with a quiet click. My pulse quickened. What could be inside that envelope, so carefully hidden away on this night of all nights as the thought burned deeper? I couldn't shake the image of the family photo without me. It felt like more than an oversight. It felt like a warning carved in silence. The drawer clicked shut, the sound echoing in my mind louder than the Christmas music still drifting through the living room. I kept my face steady, forcing a smile as if nothing had happened. But inside, unease twisted in my gut. Darlie had slipped that white envelope inside and locked it away, her movements precise, deliberate like someone hiding treasure or evidence. I tried to join in the chatter at the dinner table, but every laugh felt hollow. The smell of pine and cinnamon candles filled the air, Yet all it did was remind me how foreign this house suddenly felt. I sat quietly, nodding at jokes I didn't hear, pretending to be just another old man fading into the wallpaper. From down the hallway came a sound I couldn't ignore, Darley's hushed voice. Almost a whisper. My ears sharpened, as if my whole being leaned toward those words. Yes, after tonight. He'll sign it. The house will be ours by January. Her words cut like ice. My pulse quickened, each beat heavy with dread. Scott's voice followed, low and firm. Don't let him suspect anything. Just keep it smooth, the knife twisted deeper. So I hadn't been paranoid. My own daughter and her husband were scheming, waiting for me to slip, to sign away the only piece of dignity I still held, my home. I straightened in my chair when they returned, plastering my face with calm. The laughter rose again, forks clinking, children playing by the tree. Yet every sound grated against the storm brewing inside me. Scott's smug smile found me across the table, while Amber, sweet and innocent, played with her napkin. The contrast nearly broke me. How could a child still radiate light while her parents plotted in shadows as the plates were cleared? Scott leaned casually close. His hand slid something beneath my plate, so smooth I almost wouldn't have noticed. I lifted it discreetly, another envelope. My stomach tightened as I saw legal papers inside, lines marked with spaces for a signature. Just routine papers. Dad, Scott whispered with a syrupy tone. You'll sign them later tonight. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket when no one was looking. My hand trembled as if it held fire. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't routine, it was theft dressed in polite words. Excusing myself, I stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit like a slap, sharp and bracing. In my coat, the papers felt heavy, proof of the betrayal I had feared but hadn't wanted to name. They were trying to steal everything my wife and I had built, every brick of the home that once echoed with laughter and love. The papers in my coat pocket burned like fire evidence of their plan, and I knew I had to act. The living room was warm with laughter, but it felt colder than the December air outside as I stepped back in from the porch. My coat was heavier than usual, not because of the weather, but because of what I had slipped into its inner pocket. The envelope pressed against me like a stone I couldn't shake off. I lowered myself onto the folding chair tucked near the corner wall, its thin metal legs groaning under me. A ripple of chuckles rose from the table, and then Darley's voice, sharp enough to cut through the chatter. See, he's fine where he is. Her words floated just long enough for the room to hear, for the insult to sting. The chair creaked, echoing the truth. Fine wasn't the right word at all. I didn't belong there. I was being kept there. Scott stood tall with his glass lifted, amber liquid catching the lights strung along the mantel. To Darley, he declared, for keeping this family strong, for leading us through a difficult year. Cheers erupted around him. Glasses clinked. The words hit harder than I expected. Keeping the family strong. Once, that was me. The one who put roofs over heads, paid bills on time, made sure Christmas mornings were filled with toys and stockings. Now it was as though none of that had ever existed. Amber, with her little voice so innocent, looked up from her chair and asked, Grandpa, why don't you have your picture on the wall like Mommy? The room went silent for a beat, then erupted into nervous laughter. Darley bent down and hushed her, whispering something that only made the girl's eyes widen in confusion. I forced a smile, though the inside of me twisted. My photo wasn't missing by accident. It was erased, just like I was. The bitterness thickened, and I felt it rise like fire in my chest. My hands steadied against the table as I spoke for the first time that night, voice low but steady. Each word measured. Be careful what you build on other people's sacrifices, I said. Foundations can crack, even if the house looks strong. The words dropped like stones into a pond. Ripples spread through silence. For a moment, every eye was on me. Even the children froze. Darlie forced a laugh. Too high-pitched. Too sharp. Oh, Daddy, you're always so dramatic. Scott leaned back, smirking like he'd won something. It's Christmas. Dad, let's keep it light. Huh. My warning drifted through the room like smoke, dismissed and mocked, but still lingering. They laughed nervously, their voices picking up speed, as if drowning me out could erase what I had said. My chair wobbled as I shifted back, the metal biting into my legs. But inside me something hardened. They thought I was powerless, a relic they could ignore. Let them think it. The envelope pressed against my ribs, its corners sharp as daggers. I slid my hand into the coat pocket under the table, gripping it tight. Scott caught my eyes from across the room, that smug grin tugging at his mouth. I didn't look away. He thought he was winning. But this fight was only just beginning. The rest of dinner unfolded like a long, drawn-out play, every line spoken with forced laughter and shallow smiles. Plates clinked, forks scraped against china. But underneath it all, the silence directed at me was deafening. Eyes darted away when I looked around. I noticed Scott leaning in toward one of his friends, whispering something sharp. My ears caught just enough moving things along. The house. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. My house still carried the scent of my late wife's perfume in the hallway, the echo of children's footsteps, the memories of family dinners where laughter once filled the air. And yet here, under my daughter's roof, I felt like an intruder. At last, I set my fork down, the clatter louder than I intended. For a moment, all conversation hushed. My chest rose slowly as I drew in a breath. The words that had been burning holes inside me finally escaped. I am not invisible. My voice was calm but firm, the kind that made men pause. Every brick of this family's foundation has my fingerprints on it. Every late night, every dollar saved, every sacrifice I put them here so you could have all this. The room froze. A few cousins glanced down into their plates, ashamed to meet my eyes. The tension was heavy enough to choke on. Darlie leaned back with a scoff. Daddy, you're exaggerating again. You always cling to the past. Her dismissal was a knife to the gut. I held my ground, swallowing down the sting. Pride pushed back against humiliation, refusing to let them bury me in silence. Scott leaned forward now, his smirk cutting across the room. You're just holding on to something that isn't yours anymore, he said smoothly. It's time to let go. My palm slammed flat against the table. Glasses rattled, forks jumped. A ripple of shock spread around the room. It will always be mine, I said, my voice shaking with a fire I hadn't felt in years, until I decide otherwise. The words hung heavy. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then Amber, sweet child that she was, clutched at her mother's sleeve, eyes wide with confusion and fear. That look alone tore me apart more than Scott's smug grin ever could. The damage wasn't just between us, it was seeping into the youngest of us all. Darlie forced a laugh, trying to dissolve the moment. He's just being dramatic. Everyone, let's not make this into something bigger. But it was already bigger. The line had been drawn, plain as day. The chatter picked up again. But this time it was hollow. Not one soul spoke up to defend me. Not one voice remembered the years of sweat that built their comforts. I sat in that folding chair, more isolated than ever. But inside, something shifted. My hand brushed the coat draped over the chair. Inside, the envelope rested heavy, like a weapon waiting for its moment. They thought I had no power left. They thought wrong. Darlie leaned toward Scott, lips curling into a smirk. She didn't lower her voice enough. He won't dare go through with it, she muttered. But I heard every word. My jaw locked tight, teeth grinding against the weight of betrayal. Their laughter filled the room, But I sat still, calm on the outside, fire raging on the inside. The battle hadn't even started yet. The silence after my outburst at the table still hung heavy in the air. Plates clinked faintly as forks tapped against porcelain, but the room felt drained of warmth. Every laugh sounded rehearsed, every smile a mask. I leaned back in the folding chair, its metal creaking under me, and watched my granddaughter Amber fidget in her seat. Her little hands twisted the hem of her dress, as if she was holding in a secret. Something in her nervous shifting gnawed at me, though I tried to steady myself, to appear calm. I took a sip of water, hoping the chill would wash down the bitter taste in my mouth. Instead, it sharpened the ache inside. My eyes followed Amber, her glances toward her mother. Her whispered half-words. I could sense a storm building, though I didn't know where it would break. It happened quicker than I expected. "But Mommy," Amber blurted suddenly, her voice clear and innocent in the heavy air. "Didn't you say Grandpa's house will be ours once he's gone?" The room froze. Knives halted mid-cut. Forks hung in the air. Darlie's face drained of color as though the Christmas lights had burned her pale. Scott stiffened, his glass still in his hand. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to hear, others staring into their plates. My chest clenched. The words landed harder than any insult could. Out of the mouth of a child came the confirmation of everything I had feared, that my daughter, the very one I had raised with my own 2 hands after her mother passed, was planning to claim my home before I was even cold in the ground. Darlie snapped, her voice sharp. "Or that's not what I said. Don't talk nonsense." She forced a laugh. Too brittle, too late. Amber shrank in her seat, eyes wide. The damage was done. The truth had slipped, and it cut deep. I looked around the table. Not one of them met my eyes. Not one dared defend me. I swallowed the fire in my chest, holding it in silence, because the weight of a child's words carried more truth than any denial. Later, I stepped quietly into the hallway. The air felt cooler, almost biting, but my thoughts burned hot. I leaned against the wall, needing to breathe. When voices drifted from the kitchen, I recognized them instantly. Darlie's sharp whisper, Scott's low murmur, "We can't let him change his will now." Darlie hissed, "Keep him calm until after the new year." Scott's reply was a muffled growl, "If he resists, we'll find another way." I froze. Each word was a blade, cutting deeper than the last. My blood ran cold, my hands trembled. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination. They were scheming, planning to erase me, as though my decades of sacrifice, my entire life's work, meant nothing. My breath came slow and heavy. I pressed my palm against the wall, steadying myself, listening as their voices trailed off. Then, silence. Back alone. I stared at the Christmas lights strung across the hallway, their glow mocking me with cheer I could no longer feel. Memories flooded back: the long nights I worked double shifts, the meals I skipped so Darlie could have new clothes, the way I held her close when she cried for her mother. Every sacrifice, every tear, every brick I laid into her future now turned against me. My hand went to my coat pocket. The envelope inside was stiff, unyielding. I gripped it tighter, knowing now it wasn't just protection. It was my weapon. They thought me powerless. But this paper, this proof, was the line between survival and surrender. "If they want war," I whispered, barely loud enough for my own ears, "I'll give them one." The faint sound of church bells drifted in through the window, soft and solemn. From the dining hall came muffled laughter, cruel in its warmth, as though mocking the faith and love I had carried all these years. I straightened my back, the weight of 75 years pressing down but not breaking me. Betrayal had never rung louder than those bells, and I knew I could no longer sit silent. The laughter inside the dining room felt like a knife dragging across the skin. I steadied myself before stepping back into the room, carrying the weight of what I had just overheard. My coat felt heavier with the envelope inside, though no one else seemed to notice. When I rejoined the table, I could sense the shift in the air. My presence no longer stirred warmth, but suspicion. Their eyes darted toward me, quickly away, as though my shadow itself was an intrusion. The folded chair creaked under me again, louder this time, echoing in the silence between conversations. Darley's smile was stretched thin, her words brittle. "He's fine where he is," she muttered, making sure everyone heard. I clenched my jaw but said nothing. The storm hadn't reached its peak yet, but I could feel the air tightening like a rope around my throat. Scott tapped his glass, standing tall as if this were his stage. "I think it's time we acknowledge what's really happening," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Darley pulled a folded paper from her purse and passed it into his hand with a flourish. "This is what we've been worried about," she declared. "Dad's been forgetting things. He's not stable anymore." My chest went cold. Scott held up the paper for all to see. It looked like a note scribbled in my handwriting, shaky and uncertain. "Maybe it's best if the house goes to them now. I don't want to be a burden." Murmurs rippled around the table. Some heads tilted in sympathy, others in doubt. One cousin whispered, "Maybe he's not all there anymore." I pushed myself up, the chair groaning under me. "That is not my writing," I said firmly, the anger deepening each word. "I never wrote that. Never." But their trap had been carefully laid. The room wasn't looking at Scott or Darley with suspicion. It was me they saw under the harshest light. Amber's small voice pierced the tension. "Grandpa, did you really write that?" Her eyes were wide, confused, desperate for the truth. I looked at her, my heart breaking. "No, sweetheart. I would never put words like that on paper." But I could see the poison had already seeped into the family's veins. The others shifted in their seats, their silence louder than any accusation. Darley crossed her arms, her smirk faint but victorious. Scott leaned back, smug satisfaction on his face. Humiliation washed over me like ice water. For a moment, I almost believed they had won. Then I remembered my wife's voice, soft in my memory. "Let them tie their rope. Patience, love. The truth will tighten it around their own necks." I lowered myself back into the chair, forcing calm into my hands. My palm pressed against the envelope hidden in my coat pocket, grounding me in its weight. That was my proof, my weapon, my shield. They could spin their lies, weave their stories, and plant seeds of doubt. But I wasn't finished. Not tonight. Not ever. I sat quietly, letting them believe their performance had landed. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Scott raised his glass high, grin wide. To new beginnings. Once we set things right, I lifted my glass just enough to clink, lips curling into the faintest smile. Inside, the fire burned hotter than ever. The night isn't over, I thought, eyes locked on theirs. And neither am I. The dining room felt like it was holding its breath. Silverware lay untouched. The glow from the Christmas lights flickered against strained faces, and the silence weighed heavier than the snow pressing down outside. I had sat long enough with their whispers and their forged notes. My chest burned with words unspoken. And finally, they broke free. Why, the words slipped out low, but it carried across the table. My eyes locked on Darley. "Why must you tear apart what we built together as a family? Why are you doing this to me?" She blinked, startled for a fraction of a second, then leaned back, her arms crossed, her chin tilted high. "Don't turn this around. Daddy, you've been clinging to the past for too long. You're not the man you used to be. We've carried you, and all you do is drag us down." Her words stabbed sharper than knives. Around the table, relatives shifted, some staring at their plates, others stealing glances at Scott, who smirked as if orchestrating the whole scene. I steadied my breath, I carried this family long before you ever thought of yourself as grown. Every roof over your head, every meal on this table, it all came from my sweat and your mother's sacrifices. Don't you dare rewrite that." The tone of my voice shook the room. Even the old clock on the mantel seemed to pause in its ticking. Scott leaned forward, his grin widening. "You're talking like a martyr again. But the truth, the house, the land, even your memory, it's all fading. And you don't even realize it. Maybe it's better if someone capable runs things now." The heat rose in me. But before I could respond, a voice from the corner cut in. Well, maybe Santa should weigh in. Heads turned toward Lassie Spear, dressed in the red suit and fake beard for the children earlier that evening. She stood taller now, no trace of comedy in her stance, holding a manila folder in her hands. Her eyes were sharp, her voice firmer than I had ever heard. She set the folder on the table, slid it forward, and opened it for everyone to see. "These are photocopies of property deeds and a notarized letter. Marjorie Boone signed them years ago. They state clear as daylight that the house and assets remain with Orenthal Boone until his passing. No transfers, no loopholes." Gasps rippled through the room. I heard chairs scrape slightly as people craned to see. Scott's smug expression faltered for the first time that night. His hand, gripping his wineglass, twitched. Darlie's lips parted, but no sound came out. I pulled the papers closer, the familiar sight of Marjorie's signature steadying the storm inside me. For once, I felt the ground shift back under my feet. My wife's handwriting, her love and foresight rose up from the past to shield me in the present. Then came the most piercing truth of the night. Not from an enemy, but from innocence itself. Amber, my granddaughter, fidgeted with the hem of her dress, eyes darting between her mother and me. Then she spoke, clear and unfiltered. "But Mommy, didn't you say you hid Grandpa's letters in the kitchen drawer so no one could find them?" The words dropped like a hammer. Darlie froze. The color drained from her face. Scott hissed her name, but Amber only looked around, confused why the room had gone so still. I let the silence hang, my gaze never leaving my daughters. My voice, when it came, was steady, carrying the dignity they had tried to strip from me. Out of the mouths of babes, the truth shines brighter than your lies. The room exploded. Voices overlapped shouts, denials, defenses. Chairs scraped back. Fists hit the table. Half the family leaned toward Darlie and Scott. Others murmured in shock, their trust unraveling like thread pulled from old cloth. In the chaos, I pressed my palm over the documents, feeling their weight as if Marjorie herself stood beside me. I rose slowly, my chair groaning against the floor. "This truth," I said, voice rising above the storm, "will outlive every one of your lies." Across the table, Scott leaned toward Darlie, his face pale but his voice a venomous whisper. I caught clearly, "Then we'll bury him another way." Their desperation hung in the air, darker than any storm outside. The dining room was heavy with silence after the eruption of voices and slammed fists. Plates sat untouched, candles flickered, and the sound of the clock on the mantel seemed louder than anyone's breathing. My gaze swept the table, and I saw what truth had done. It had split my family right down the middle. Some averted their eyes, embarrassed by the lies they had followed. A few others shifted uncomfortably, but dared to nod my way, acknowledging what they knew deep down all along. Relief touched me, though faint and hollow. It wasn't the triumphant kind. It was the kind a soldier feels when he crawls out of a trench after a battle, covered in dirt and knowing more war lies ahead. My heart was tired, yet steadied. For the first time that night, I felt like I wasn't the only one who saw the web Darlie and Scott had spun. The fracture widened quickly. Voices rose again, but this time in different tones. My nephew, his face red with anger. pushed back his chair. "Grandpa deserves better than this," he said firmly. It was the first voice, not mine, to call the truth out loud. A cousin snapped back, defending Darley, shouting about family unity and respect. Unity, I thought bitterly. What kind of unity was it when they carved me out of my own bloodline story as the shouting tangled across the table? My mind drifted where the noise could not reach. I thought of the nights I worked double shifts, the mornings I left before sunrise, the years of carrying burdens so Darley could go to college without debt. I thought of Scott, young and desperate years ago, sitting at my kitchen table after he lost his first job, and me writing a check to keep him afloat. And now those same mouths I had fed, those same hands I had held, were moving to erase me. The memory of Marjorie came sharp, my late wife's voice in my ear, "Keep the family whole. Orrin, don't let them drift." My jaw tightened. She wanted unity. I had tried. God knows, I had tried. But unity built on lies was no unity at all. Across the table, cracks began to show. A cousin squinted at Scott, her arms folded. "If what you showed us was true, then why doesn't the timeline match that letter look brand new?" Another relative murmured agreement. Scott's smile faltered, and I saw him grip his glass too tightly, his knuckles whitening. The room leaned, ever so slightly, against him now. His composure cracked like glass under a hammer. I stayed quiet. Let their doubt grow. Let their questions multiply. I had no need to shout anymore. The truth was seeping through the cracks they had made themselves. Darley clutched Scott's arm, her face drained of its color. She whispered something sharp and fast, but I could see at the first flicker of fear in her eyes. Not guilt, not shame, but fear. And that fear told me I was winning. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps on the door. Sharp as a gavel on wood, the room froze. No one moved. Slowly, Scott rose, but I already knew. When the door opened, the tall frame of Stephen Avery stood in the hallway, a leather briefcase in hand. The lawyer's eyes scanned the table, the broken family, the tension you could slice with a knife. The air shifted. This wasn't just a Christmas Eve gathering anymore. This was a courtroom waiting to happen. The knock at the door came like a thunderclap in the silence. Every eye turned toward it. Suspicion and unease thick in the air. My legs carried me across the floor, heavier than they'd ever felt. When I opened the door, Stephen Avery stood there, briefcase in hand, his calm presence slicing through the chaos like a blade. He stepped inside without needing an invitation, setting his case squarely on the dining table. The room hushed as he clicked it open. His voice carried authority, steady and sure. "I was asked to bring clarity tonight, and that's what I intend to do." For the first time in hours, a sliver of hope flickered inside my chest. Stephen's hands moved methodically as he laid out the documents. He pulled out certified deeds, neatly stacked wills, and a notarized letter written in Marjorie's familiar hand. The sight alone nearly buckled my knees. "This," he said, sliding the top sheet forward, "confirms Orenthal Boone as the sole rightful owner of this property. This home, and the assets tied to it, remain his until his passing, exactly as his late wife intended." He read aloud Marjorie's words, her plea to protect the man she had loved, the man who had sacrificed for his family. Each line cut through the lies that had poisoned this house tonight. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, but I held them back. This wasn't the time for breaking, it was the time for standing tall. Murmurs rippled across the room. Cousins and nieces who had cast their eyes away earlier now looked at me with respect again. The tide was turning. Stephen's gaze turned to Scott, who sat frozen, jaw tight. "Now, about these so-called updated documents." Stephen continued, lifting a second folder. "Forensic analysis was conducted. The signatures don't match Mr. Boone's legal hand. The ink is fresh, and the notarization is falsified. In plain words, these are forgeries. Gasps erupted. Darley's face drained of color, her lips parting in shock. The smug grin that had clung to Scott all night faltered into something uglier fear. My hands rested on the table, steady as stone. For once, I didn't have to raise my voice. The truth spoke loud enough. You tried to erase me with lies, I thought as I looked at Scott. But lies have short legs. They can't run far. The shame fell hardest on Darley. Her siblings, cousins, even Amber all turned their eyes to her. Disappointment plain, her daughter whispered, "Mommy, is it true?" The words seemed to strike harder than any gavel. Darley opened her mouth, but nothing came. Only stutters, broken syllables that dissolved into silence. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but unshakable. The truth was always stronger than your lies. You thought I was weak, that my years made me blind. But time hasn't stolen my strength, it's sharpened it. Amber clutched her small hands together, confusion in her wide eyes. The weight of betrayal wasn't hers to carry, but she had witnessed it. My heart broke for her, even as pride swelled that she had spoken the truth earlier. Stephen closed his case, his expression grave. What's been revealed tonight doesn't end here. Forgery is a crime. If they were willing to falsify documents to strip Mr. Boone of his rights, this must be investigated by the proper authorities. The words froze the air. My family feud had just outgrown these walls. Then, faint in the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the night. The sound grew closer, flashing blue and red lights dancing across the window pane. The room stiffened. I sat back, calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, justice felt within reach. The door rattled with another knock. The flashing blue and red lights washed across the windows, painting the walls with a restless glow. Every conversation had died the moment the sirens approached. When the knock came, it echoed through the bones of the house, louder than any argument that had filled it earlier that night. Stephen Avery stepped forward, calm as ever, and opened the door for the officers. Their heavy boots pressed against the carpet as they entered, their presence shifting the air instantly. My daughter Darley stiffened in her seat. Scott gripped his glass, but his knuckles turned white. For the first time all evening, their bravado cracked. I sat still. Age had slowed my movements, but my eyes were sharp. I watched the panic creep into their faces, the unease spreading among the rest of the family. It was as though the truth I had been carrying alone had finally grown legs and walked into the room. One officer placed a folder on the table. "We've been made aware of possible forged documents and property disputes," he said. Scott cleared his throat, tried to laugh, but the sound wavered. Darley's eyes darted to him, silently begging for a plan. He had none. They asked their questions slowly, each word deliberate, like drops of water wearing down a stone. Scott's voice faltered when pressed about dates. His story twisted one way, then another, but none of it held. Darley tried to throw the blame my way, claiming I was forgetful, that maybe I had signed something without realizing. Stephen interrupted with the cold weight of evidence. Documents in order, signatures verified. The air grew heavier. Every lie they'd built was unraveling thread by thread. Watching them squirm should have felt like victory, but it didn't. Not yet. I rose, my knees aching as I pushed the chair back. The room grew still again, every eye fixed on me. For years I had swallowed silence, letting dignity carry me through storms, but silence had nearly buried me alive. "I gave this family everything I had," I said, voice even but tired. 2 jobs, long nights, the roof over your heads. When your mother passed, I raised you alone. Darley, I patched your scraped knees, paid for your schooling, stood in the crowd every time you thought no one cared. And now Now I'm just that old man. The words cut deeper than any police question could. I saw Amber's face crumple as she buried herself in my side, whispering, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." Some of the younger ones shifted, ashamed. Even those who had doubted me looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Tears welled, not from weakness, but from the weight of it all, the years, the sacrifices, the betrayal. If the measure of a man is forgotten when his usefulness fades, then what is a family worth? You took my seat, my voice, and tried to take my home. But you can't erase the truth. Not now. Not ever. The silence that followed was thicker than any shouting match. Scott stared at the table. Jaw clenched, Darlie glared at me. But her fire was gone, smothered by the evidence and her own daughter's arms around me. Whispers spread, not against me this time, but against them. Some cried quietly. One nephew muttered that I deserved better. A cousin shook his head at Scott, disgust plain on his face. The fortress of lies had collapsed, leaving only rubble at their feet. As the officers began gathering papers and preparing to escort Scott for further questioning, I turned toward the window. The night outside was still, the faint hum of the sirens fading into distance. Maybe Marjorie had been right all along. She used to say, "The truth always finds its way home." And then, as though summoned by her words, Stephen approached me with an envelope in his hand. "Your wife left this," he said softly. "It was meant for you." The paper trembled in my fingers. A final message from Marjorie, waiting all these years. Stephen placed the envelope in my hands as the house fell into silence. The paper was yellowed, her handwriting on the front still familiar after all these years for Orenthal. When the time comes. My fingers trembled, not from age alone, but from the weight of everything that had led to this night. The room seemed to hold its breath as I broke the seal. Inside was Marjorie's letter, written in the steady strokes of the woman who had been my anchor for nearly half a century. Her voice returned to me as though she were standing in the room. She wrote of foresight, of her fear that greed might one day creep into the corners of our family. She reminded me of our shared dream that our home and what we built would remain a sanctuary, not a prize to be fought over. She named me, in explicit words, the sole guardian of our estate, empowered to protect it until my last breath, and she left instructions for Amber and the children, safeguarded in trust, far beyond the reach of any who had let dishonor cloud their hearts. The silence broke into whispers. Scott's face drained of color. Darlie's lips parted, searching for excuses that wouldn't come. The letter was clear, undeniable, and unshakable. In one stroke of Marjorie's hand, their schemes collapsed. Police officers, already present, nodded to Stephen as he handed over the forged papers. "Forgery and attempted fraud," one officer said flatly. Scott blustered, raising his voice, but his bravado slipped into stammering. Darlie, once so composed, shrank in her seat, her confidence crumbling as the family stared. Some turned away in shame, others shook their heads in disbelief. When the handcuffs clicked, there was no applause, only the heavy sound of truth settling in. Their humiliation was not shouted down, it was quiet, raw, and complete. I remained seated, my hand resting on Marjorie's letter. When I stood, the room hushed again. My voice did not rise in anger. It carried the weary authority of years lived and lessons earned. "Wealth is nothing but dust in the wind." I told them, "You can build a house of gold, but if it stands on greed, it will collapse. What endures is integrity, respect, and the love we give each other. That's what Marjorie and I built this family on, and that's what you almost destroyed tonight." Amber stepped toward me, her eyes brimming with tears. She pressed her small hand into mine. "I'll never let it be like this again." "Grandpa," she whispered. For the first time that night, Warmth touched my chest. I looked around the room, at the faces marked by shame, by grief, by the dawning recognition that choices carry consequences. They tried to steal my name, my home, and my worth, I said, holding Marjorie's letter aloft. But this love, this legacy cannot be taken. It is not in the bank, but in the heart. The night closed on that truth. Scott and Darley were led away into the cold air, their silhouettes swallowed by flashing lights. The rest of us sat in silence. No feast, no gifts, no laughter, only reflection, and perhaps a beginning. Amber leaned against me, her voice soft but certain. I'll raise my children differently. And I believed her. They say betrayal wounds deepest when it comes from your own. That's true. But dignity, once reclaimed, heals stronger than before. Marjorie had prepared me for this battle even from beyond the grave, reminding me that foresight protects, truth redeems, and respect preserves legacy. For those who grow old, never believe your worth fades with age, and for the young, greed consumes everything it touches, but respect for family that will carry you further than any inheritance. That Christmas morning, justice was not in the police reports or the deeds secured in my name. Justice lived in the lesson left behind. The true inheritance is not money, it is the values you leave carved into the hearts of those who remain.